Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I'm going to bless you with a revisit of a Lich build guide that I did a while ago. And that's right, we're back with more last Epoch. Not only that, but this build is pretty special as well. It was my fourth video ever that I made for this YouTube channel. We draw power from setting ourselves on fire, which I think as an acolyte is great thematically, makes a lot of sense. This build was fantastic when I first discovered it in January of this year. However, it got giga nerfed by the nerf bat of 0.9 in March. And I kind of just wrote it off. I didn't think it was very viable after that, but I was always a little bit curious. Can the build still perform? Given that it took down Jorah in 38 seconds back then, how much worse is it now? So that's what we're gonna do in this video here. We're going to check out how much better or worse the build is and do a brand new build guide based on 0.91. So if you want to check out a super unique build that nobody else is running, I guarantee you, this build is still somewhat viable. You can see we take about 65 seconds to kill Jorah. It's definitely nerfed, but still viable. So if you ever get a chance, check it out. Now let's do the build guide. Irashaimase! Alright, here we are. Let's go over the build guide. But before we get into the skills and itemization, I wanted to highlight the build concept because it's a little bit of a trickier item and skill interaction. Basically, we're only spamming Spirit Plague, and we're not spamming it to actually dish out DPS. We're spamming it so that we can trigger Exsanguination, which basically applies bleed stacks on ourselves. And here you can see it applies 3 bleed stacks on ourselves per cast. Then we combine that with Malin's Hubris, which converts bleed chance to ignite chance, and that actually converts our bleed stacks to ignite stacks. So now we're applying 3 ignite stacks on ourselves per cast of Spirit Plague. The final piece of the puzzle is Immolator's Oblation. You can see that it gives us 6 spell damage for fire and necrotic skills per stack of ignite on you, up to 40. So the giga nerf that I mentioned was that the up to 40 part wasn't there when I first did this build. It was added afterwards, and it's pretty much specifically to target this playstyle because there is no way to get over 40 stacks of ignite on you without doing what we're doing right here. So now that you know the main concept and the mechanics that make this build work, let's actually go through the skills. Starting with Spirit Plague. The most important piece here is Exsanguination, so that we can apply ignite on ourselves. Perpetuity is also incredibly strong because it gives us 60% increased cast speed. That is tremendous, so we can apply even more ignite stacks on ourselves. And then Toxic Transmission, 3 poison stacks per cast on the enemy, which is our actually defensive measure because we convert those poison stacks into armor thanks to Soul Feast, and I'll go over that in a little bit. But those are the 3 main components. I like to get a frailty stack over here, and then you can pretty much do whatever you want with the remaining points. Then we also have Transplant for extra mobility and for 15% kill threshold, as well as a little bit of bone armor. And, it's just a pretty standard transplant setup. 3 seconds of frenzy duration is really strong, but it's pretty straightforward. Reaper form, the things to note here are Unholy Domination, so that we can have Reap and Transplant not sharing a cooldown and be able to activate both in parallel. Rapid Destruction is great because of the 30% cast speed. We love cast speed with this build. It gives us more stacks of Ignite. And then some damage from these nodes. Crit Multiplier from here. And Marked for Death Chance. We don't really have too many Marked for Death Chance mechanics into this build, so this is the only one pretty much. This is the only source. A different way you can take Reaper form is if you take out 4 points of Crit Multi, take down 2 points of Death Touch Scythe, and then invest those 6 points into Mistress of Decay and maxing out Soul Shroud, so that we can have 4 armor per point of intelligence. And this stacks very nicely with the percent armor bonuses from Soul Feast. So I think that is also a solid way to go. It is way more defensive. You're trading damage for defense, and honestly, Your damage is great if you're doing monoliths, and you probably don't need this a little bit of crit multi and a little bit of necrotic damage for spells. You got to keep in mind that we're getting like 240 spell damage from our belt. So 2 or 4 spell damage here makes no difference. Next, let's go over Death Seal. And this is our main source of DPS. And that is through our death waves. You can see we convert them to casting every second. And then we add frequency, we add crit chance, we add duration for our Death Seal. And as usual, Deadlock. So this is a pretty standard setup. The only thing I would mention is we don't really go into Hungering Soul frequency. We don't want to rely on Hungering Souls. We just put 1 value point for a little bit of extra damage, but then we put the remaining 2 points that we have into Doom Call. That is actually a damage multiplier that stacks really nicely and synergizes really well with our item choice for this specific build, because we're going to get 15 to 20 stacks of Damned thanks to our items and thanks to this Doom Call, which is 150 to 200% more damage. It's at the top end 3x the damage. So definitely make sure to get at least 1 point in this skill. That's a must-have. Honestly, it is also not a bad idea to get extra wave of death area right here, maybe just 1 point. And you can even think about adding a few more multipliers in this direction if you happen to have extra skill points. The Death Seal skill tree synergizes quite well with death waves. And I just want to highlight that because we're not using Hungering Souls, and if you remember when I first did this series of build guides, I actually had 3 different build guides, and 2 of them relied heavily on Hungering Souls, and specifically on this Unholy Trinity node. And it's such a bad feeling to play with Unholy Trinity. Whenever your skeletons die, your damage gets reduced by 80%. You deal 1/5 of the damage because of these 2 nodes right here if you have them maxed out. And against Jorah, for example, she wipes your 3 skeletons in 1 shot. And if you're relying on killing enemies to generate skeleton vanguards, it's just an awful way to play. You don't have any way to regenerate them. So generally speaking, I don't like playing with Unholy Trinity. So that's why I much prefer this setup that doesn't rely on Hungering Souls, does not rely on Unholy Trinity and keeping our minions alive. The damage coming from this build setup is consistent, it's stable, so it's much better to play around. And finally, we have Soul Feast. And honestly, the only reason we have Soul Feast is Toxic Craving. You can see that it converts our poison stacks on the enemy to armor at a 6% per stack ratio. And so when we apply 3 stacks on a single Soul Feast cast, that's 18% armor bonus. So you definitely want to get as much flat armor from your items and maybe other skills as you can, so that this percent armor bonus multiplicatively scales that flat armor. Otherwise, there's not much to talk about. We got a little bit of damage, mana efficiency, and yeah, you just do whatever you want. And now let's go over the items for the build. I'll start with the core items for the build that make or break the build itself. And then I'll move on to semi-core and the remaining items that you have a lot more flexibility on. So there are 2 core items for this build. One is Malin's Hubris. We need to convert our bleed chance to ignite chance. For affixes on it, if you happen to have 1 or 2 LP Hubris, I would recommend cast speed. If you want to go a defensive route as well, that's not bad. Generally, you want to be maxing out your endurance percent at 60 and then getting endurance threshold at about 1/3 of your health. Because when we activate Death Seal, we're going to be at 1/3 of our health. So there's a really good synergy with the endurance for Lich. The second core item for the build is Immolator's Oblation. And this is because of the spell damage that we get, up to 40 per ignite stack times 6. That is tremendous. That is 240 spell damage. That's pretty much tripling or quadrupling your spell damage, depending on your other items and stuff like that. Next, for semi-core, you want to get Marina's Lost Soul, and this is primarily for the You Are Damned when you cast a spell affix on it. That synergizes really well with Doom Call. The wand is also just nice in general. It's got solid flat necrotic spell damage as well as percent increased spell damage, great cast speed, and the only issue is that it is unlikely to get 2 LP ever. So you're going to have a 1 LP Marina's Lost Soul, And then the question is, what tier 7 do you want to attempt to slot into it? In my case, I went with cast speed. However, I did that before the nerf of Immolator's Oblation. After that nerf, I think there's a good argument to be made to actually switch that into critical strike multiplier. The greatest source of crit multi is your weapon. Much better than amulets, much better than, let's say, offhand, stuff like that. It just goes to a much higher number. And in the case of cast speed here, you can actually see that I took down 2 points out of exsanguination. So if you're running into a situation when you're having a hard time hitting 40 stacks of ignite on yourself, you can just put more points in exsanguination. So you could totally get away with reducing your cast speed and adding more crit multi. So that's where I would go with Marina's Lost Soul. And I would say this is the only semi-core item for the build. This legendary ring right here is nice to have, but it's not necessarily must have. I would say, yeah, if you happen to have it with a strong 1 or 2 LP on it and really good affixes, go ahead, use it because of the cast speed and the necrotic damage. But it's not a must-have, especially now that this has been nerfed. The build doesn't scale with cast speed as well as it used to. Otherwise, every other item is pretty much find what you can from suffixes so that you can max your crit avoid. I should have 100% here. Max your endurance. I should have 60% here. I just haven't had the opportunity to min-max as well as I would like. And then max your res and then get as much health as you can. You can see here I have a tier 7 necrotic damage ring with int. But yeah, I'll just hover over some of my items. Like this armor is not great because of the really bad suffixes. This helmet is solid. You like death seal levels just because it scales really well with the build itself. And then, you know, these are the rest of my items. Balance your cast speed in a way that you can get enough to consistently and easily hit this 40 stack limit. Try to get 100% critical strike chance with death waves. There's another 30% crit chance on death waves that is not visible in this row right here. So I pretty much have 100% crit chance on death waves. And now in terms of idols, I would recommend crit chance and percent health idols. Those are really strong for the build. And also just health idols and a little bit of resistances here and there just to get your res maxed out. In terms of blessings, crit multi is ideal for this one right here. Lightning res is ideal for the next one. Crit strike avoidance is what I would go for in Reign of Dragons. All res is not bad here either, but I think crit avoid is slightly better in this case. And just to go over my thought process as to why crit avoid is better here, it's more about what you can get out of the other blessings. If there is no real good blessing to take out of Ending of the Storms, you're going to be getting the lightning res blessing because that completely solves one of your res. And similarly here, if you don't need crit multi, in our case we do, but just in general, if you don't need crit multi, you're highly likely to get void res from this blessing. Here, if you don't need, let's say, percent armor, which we really don't, we have plenty from Soul Feast. And if you don't need some of the endurance threshold bonuses, you can get physical resistance. And now that we've had 2 of our resistances solved with these 2 blessings, it doesn't really make sense to get all res here. You're not getting the benefit of the 20% in 2 of your resistance types. Possibly 3 because fire res is really easy to max. And so in cases where your benefit is halved because you're only hitting 4 of those 7 resistance types, it makes more sense to just go for crit avoid and itemize to max out your res. Like I mentioned, flat res is really good for this build, so you would definitely want flat res for Spirits of Fire. And that's it for blessings. On the passive front, I have flat armor, int and necrotic res to help me max out res, some vit, and here we have some necrotic damage. This is not a must-have. You can drop this 6 points if you need them elsewhere. A little bit of health here, and then mostly everything else is in the Lich tree. Extra damage, life leech, necrotic damage, extra health, a lot of int at the cost of health regeneration reduction, which by the way doesn't hurt us very much because we're running Reperform, which completely negates our health regen. Necrotic penetration because we have a necrotic skill, and then some crit nodes right here. A little bit of move speed, attack speed, and leech, spell damage, because we are indeed using a one-handed weapon and we don't have a shield equipped. And finally, a little bit of spell steal. And now let's go over the skill rotation for this build. It's fairly straightforward. You want to always have Reperform active, pretty much. So here we go, we activate it. And then you want to start spamming Spirit Plague. And you can see that starts stacking Ignite on our hero, as well as Damned. And you want to make sure that you have at least 40 stacks of Ignite before activating Death Seal. Because the spell damage that Death Waves use is snapshotted at the point of activation of Death Seal. So however many stacks of Ignite you have at that point, that's how much spell damage bonus you're getting for your belt. So that's the biggest thing I want to highlight. Make sure you have 40 stacks of Ignite before you activate Death Seal. I think that Doom Call is dynamic through the duration of Death Seal. I could be wrong though. And then as you're casting Spirit Plague, make sure to occasionally cast Soul Feast as well to get a bunch of stacks of armor on yourself. And that's pretty much it. You can cast Transplant for mobility purposes or to get Frenzy and Haste applied on yourself. You can use Reap for mobility as well. And it's also a decent way to activate your haunting here for Mark for Death, because it is doubled for Reap. So you can get a 30% chance to activate Mark for Death. But really, that's about it. And now let's say you're actually switching into this build. Keep in mind that you must have these two core items before you consider switching into this build. Otherwise, it doesn't really make sense. You're not getting the benefit of this, igniting yourself. But if you do have those two core items, I would recommend you can try it out. Get Spirit Plague. Make sure to go for Exsanguination first. Level that up to the point where you have enough stacks of Ignite on yourself. Get your Perpetuity afterwards, and then your Frailty stack. Only go for Toxic Transmission if you have Soul Feast and especially Toxic Craving leveled up. And then the rest are pretty straightforward. For Death Seal, you definitely want to make sure to get your Deadlock and your Duration and then your Mortal Pulse right away. And the build doesn't quite kick in until you have at least some points in Tachycadria, as well as Doom Call. And so yeah, it's pretty straightforward if you actually have the items to level up your skills correctly. And now let's go over the verdict for this build. This is one of my favorite parts. We get to see how it compares with other builds. So this is our usual spreadsheet here, and the build is already listed. I had it listed previously and I just didn't know after the patch how it would perform. The time is roughly 50 to 70 seconds to kill tier 4 Jorah. We already have a bunch of other B tiers that are around the same time. And it's decent, but it leaves a little bit to be desired. The AoE of the build is where it excels though. So it's actually decent at monoliths farming. And after this, I'll showcase 500 plus corruption monoliths, just so you can see what it does. The mobility is great. We have 2 mobility skills. We're pretty quick. And so overall for monolith farming, it's S- is where I put it at. And it's definitely better than single target. I didn't itemize very well for survivability, and we do require a few items that make survivability a little bit weaker. The weapon, for example, takes down HP by 10%. That makes a little bit of a difference. But overall, I put it at A. It's got mobility, so it's not too bad. With the right itemization, and again, mine was really bad, you can get a lot out of this build. Multiplayer utility, not much to be had there. Cost to itemize. You do require the gloves and the belt to make this build work, and preferably 1-2 LP at that. The weapon as well, having a 1 LP Marina's Soul makes a huge difference. I had it at B previously, but I do believe it should be either B+ or A-, in fact. It's not too bad. It only requires a couple of items. It's not bad. The final tier I have for this build is A-, and it's around that area, A- to maybe B+. So you can see some of the other A- that it compares with. Lightning Blast Meteor Belt. Yeah. Bleed Javelin. Yeah, that one's so-so as well. Dragon Song, Kelthan, hybrid build. Yeah, I think that's the right company to have in the A- range. And the only note that I have is that the 0.9 nerf pad hit this build pretty hard. But even though the build was hit hard, it's still viable, and that's important. I think having variety of builds available out there for people to try and enjoy the game with is something that every ARPG developer should have as a primary objective. I think that's one of the biggest strengths for and enjoyment elements of ARPGs, trying different builds out. Anyways, that is the verdict, folks. And that's the complete build guide. I'll leave you with Corruption 512 mono running in the background while we wrap up and while we chat about some channel plans and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm back on last Epoch. I want to prepare a few level 100 characters before the next patch so that I can test builds as soon as the patch hits. Hopefully we get news on the patch soon. I have no idea when it's coming out. From what I gather, EHG are going to be at Gamescom later this month, so we should get some news then. Hopefully everything's tracking to schedule and we get new content soon. But otherwise, as you can see, I'm trying different things with my channel. I still haven't figured out exactly how I want to pivot and the direction I want to take it. Diablo wasn't as fun as I thought. Doing game reviews I don't think works as well for me because I feel like I can't do a proper game review until I've invested like hundreds or at least tens of hours into the game, and that is a big commitment. I don't have that kind of time, unfortunately, especially for some of these epic games that are coming out. I'm not sure that I can do all of them justice. It was fun though to do the review on Everspace too. But yeah, I'll switch to some last Epoch content. I'm now playing online and leveling up a shaman. So if you want to watch that progress and see if we can come up with a cool build, join me on Twitch. And otherwise, I just want to say thanks again to everybody who's been supportive while I'm figuring things out here and just transitioning from one thing to another. It's fun to try things out, and I'm sure eventually we'll land with something fun. Things have also been a bit hectic outside of gaming, you know, IRL stuff. So I haven't had as much time and even energy as I'd like to game and do videos, but hopefully that changes in 2 or 3 months. There are a few things that are going to improve on my end, but we'll see. Other than that, I'll probably share some of my shaman experiences soon, but I'm also not pushing it as hard as I can. I'm playing probably 50% of the time last Epoch and 50% of the time Baldur's Gate 3. Because Baldur's Gate 3 is an amazing game and Larian Studios have outdone themselves, so I just have to try it. But anyways, that's it from me. Take it easy. I'm gonna go level up my shaman and play some Baldur's Gate 3. Gochiso sama deshita.